My last guest this evening is the former governor of New Hampshire and the former White House chief of staff under George H.W. Bush. With all the media attention around the Bush family given Jeb Bush's entry into the 2016 GOP presidential race, tonight we focus on the patriarch. I sat down with John Sununu recently here in our D.C. studio to talk about the new papal encyclical, presidential politics, and his new memoir about his White House years called The Quiet Man, the Indispensable Presidency of George H.W. Bush. Here's my interview with John Sununu. Governor Sununu, first of all, thanks for being here.
You're nice to have me on. Thank you.
I was surprised reading this book that you have a Palestinian background and you're part Orthodox, part Catholic. How did this come to be? Tell people that little bit of your biography.
My grandfather came to Boston in 1904 and was part of the Greek Orthodox community there. My father was born in Boston, and that's the story.
But born in Havana?
Well, my dad was in the import-export business, and he and my mother went down there while he was doing a project, and you always get born where your mother is, you know.
It happens like that sometimes, doesn't it?
Right.
Let's talk for a moment. Why did it take you 20 years to write this book, The Quiet Man, which is really your memoir and a reflection on the career and the contributions of George H.W. Bush?
Well, it's not really a memoir. It's about 3.5 years, 4 years worth of what the president did. But I had promised the president I wasn't going to write one of those who's kissing who and who's kicking whom in the White House books. But about 1.5 years ago, I went up to see him in Kennebunk, and I said, you know, I'm going to break my promise. And he looked at me, and I said, you know, I believe I need to write a book putting everything you accomplished between a pair of covers so that the people will understand how significant what you did was. And he and Barbara Bush both said, go to it.
Why now? Why do it now? I mean, you could have done this 20 years ago.
Well, I don't think he would have been understood as well. A lot of what he did, you know, people are beginning to appreciate him more, and a lot of what he did had to show that it stood the test of time. And so the credibility, the timing really is taking advantage of the credibility that comes with time.
There's a comment in the book. You say, after FDR and LBJ, Bush's domestic legislation is the most prolific, consequential, and precedent-setting of all the modern presidents.
It is.
Why?
It is. He passed a budget bill that put budgeting rules back in the game and created the surpluses and the growth of the 90s. He took the logjam, 13-year logjam on clean air, and passed that legislation based on free market and market principles rather than just command and control, so that we reduced emissions at a cost of 1/5 or 1/10 of what it otherwise would have cost. He deregulated energy, and we're now enjoying the benefits of a deregulated energy structure and all the advantages that come with it. On a civil rights bill, he actually had the political courage to veto a badly written civil rights bill and then get a good one passed. He promoted and passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. He took the farm program, which was all subsidies, and converted some of the subsidies into incentives for exports. We can go on. Crime bill.
See, this is what happens when you have a chief of staff. You know every bill that passed or didn't, and it's probably encyclopedically filed
But
somewhere.
The point is, it was dramatic, strong, and important legislation.
You say something. You say he had a strong moral and cultural sense. When was that most in evidence from your perspective?
Well, there were a lot of tough issues that came. I think it would be of interest to your viewers to know that on almost 24 occasions, we had to invoke either an actual veto or a threat of a veto over the life issue. And George Bush stood for life as firmly as any president has. When he had to make the decision to send young men and women into harm's way in the Gulf War, I could see in the president the personal anguish, and just before he did it, he actually had a phone conversation with the Episcopalian bishop who disagreed with him, but they prayed on the phone for the president to make the right choice.
Wow. You say he was a deft diplomat, and that you make reference here with the relationship with Mitterrand and France was not in the best shape coming out of the Reagan administration, and yet you say Bush healed it. How so?
Francois Mitterrand and Ronald Reagan had gotten into a personality conflict. I think that's the easiest way to express it. On policy, of course, but they just didn't mesh. The president wanted to take advantage of the opportunity of perhaps getting the Soviets out of Eastern Europe and helping reunify Europe. He needed a cohesive NATO. France, Germany, United Kingdom, those are the three key allies he had to bring together. Mitterrand was a key to it all. And so the president invited Francois Mitterrand to Kennebunkport. And there was George Bush at his Mitterrand comes dressed to the nines. George Bush is as informal as possible. It looked to me in Scowcroft like this was going to be a difficult situation. But the president deferred to Francois Mitterrand. He had been president longer, and so he asked him for his advice. He sat and listened to his suggestions. And Mitterrand was a great viewer of history with the big picture. And over hours of discussion, by the time they finished in 2 days, they were as close and focused on what the president wanted to do in Europe.
You have been slightly criticized, and not so slightly, in other places, about what you've written in this book, when you say George Bush and Francois Mitterrand were world-class leaders. Was Ronald Reagan not a world-class leader?
But he was. But the last 2 years in the Reagan administration really ended up with a couple of little problems like this as the president began to have trouble with Congress and as Iran-Contra caused some difficulties. And Mitterrand came with a view that was not in coincidence with what Ronald Reagan wanted at the time.
Did they get along, George Bush and Ronald Reagan? Because ideologically, at least when they were contending for the nomination earlier, before Ronald Reagan was elected, there was tension. These men were occupying two wings of the party.
But they weren't. They were both conservatives. George Bush was as conservative as Ronald Reagan on the fundamental issues of freedom, free enterprise, not liking taxes, wanting to cut spending, smaller government, incentives for the family to get the benefits rather than institutions. They were in sync on that. But they did get along extremely well. After Ronald Reagan offered George Bush the nomination as vice president, all the bygones, if you will, of the political campaign, as smart politicians usually do, were forgotten, and they were a team, a true team.
Was the read my lips, no new taxes pledge a bridge too far a mistake?
In retrospect, of course it was. I'm not sure everybody recognized it as such at that time. I wasn't part of the writing of the speech, but as a governor who has to accept legislation with increases in fees and adjustments to taxes, I did cringe a little bit when I heard it, and I had hoped that somehow they could have put a little bit of a rounder shape on it rather than those sharp edges. But he tried to fulfill that commitment. The first budget, the first-year budget, we were able to get it without taxes. But then Foley and Mitchell, Tom Foley running the House, George Mitchell leading the Senate, they were determined to make him pay the ransom, and for the good of the country, he saw he had to.
You mentioned here the lighter side of George Bush, which we don't hear a lot about. There's some great anecdotes. One, he's bored at one of these European meetings, and you've got the German chancellor up front who apparently was having a love affair with desserts and couldn't stop. And the president, George H.W. Bush, is writing little limericks. What were they, and how did you get to see them?
Well, he would write these bawdy limericks, and Scowcroft and I were sitting behind, and he would fold it as if it was a missive of significant importance and hand it to us. And Scowcroft and I would have to read these with a straight face and nod. And, but I can tell you, as a good chief of staff, I kept none.
You kept none of them, but you do you have you remember the ends of a few of these, which you mention here. Something about and her husband Dennis couldn't catch up with her.
Yeah, and even her husband Dennis couldn't catch her.
A reference to Lady Thatcher.
Right.
We'll leave it there, and you can imagine the other limericks.
Yeah.
They are interesting and fun. I want to move on to Iraq for a minute. The president, George H.W. Bush, and Brent Scowcroft made a very wise calculation.
And Jimmy Baker.
And James Baker, of course. That they would go into Kuwait, remove Saddam Hussein and his forces from Kuwait, but not march into Baghdad.
For two reasons.
Why?
Number one, The president had built a coalition, including Arab countries, who were a very active part of that and had gone to the UN and gotten resolutions on what he said we wanted to do and what he indicated to them we wouldn't do. And the resolutions had a line drawn, and it was not to occupy Baghdad. And secondly, the president, the reason he accepted that is he knew that an occupation force in the Middle East would be in quicksand up to their eyeballs.
He and Scowcroft wrote in their own book in 1998, had we gone the invasion route, the U.S. could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land. How
very prophetic.
Yeah,
very prophetic.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Now, given all of that, what do you make of George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq and where we are today?
You have to give it the right context. Post 9/11, the United States is recovering from the worst attack on the United States in history. The president is responsible for the safety of this country.
But bin Laden was in Afghanistan. He wasn't in Iraq.
But there were all kinds of people all over the place. Now, I don't know the intelligence he had, but all the intelligence agencies were in concert. The French, the British, the Germans, the Israelis, the U.S., and the Saudis.
Here's my question. Would George H.W. Bush have sent those troops in?
It depends what the intelligence actually was. If the intelligence says you should go in, he would have. And if the intelligence wasn't strong enough to go in, he wouldn't have. That's the only right answer to that hypothetical
But remember,
question.
but it's not hypothetical. Scowcroft and Baker were against the invasion of Iraq and wrote op-eds to that effect because of their sense of history, which I think the President George H.W. Bush profoundly understood.
But even Brent,
the Middle East.
But even Brent and Jimmy didn't have all the intelligence that the president had at that time. I understand them making those recommendations. I saw the op-eds, but I always recognize that a president has to make the last decision. He has to concern himself with the safety of the country, and I understand how hard it is when you're seeing every I and dotted and T crossed in the intelligence reports.
Will that decision, you think, hurt Jeb Bush's run for the presidency?
I think any candidate has to run on their own. Now, you carry both the benefit and the burden of your heritage.
Right.
The power of breeding stock, I call it. And I think he's going to have to figure out how to deal so that he maximizes the benefit and minimizes the negative.
Yeah, no,
that's an art form.
Yeah, no, well, it is, and one that takes some getting used to, I imagine. What do you make of the rise of ISIS? And do you think that the United States in some way created not ISIS, but the circumstances into which ISIS could be born?
Leaving the Iraqis without the support of 10, 15,000 American troops was a huge mistake. And the withdrawal of those troops from there created a power vacuum, not just in military might, but a political power vacuum. And when there is a vacuum, mischief takes place. And you're dealing in a country where every ministry is treated as an ATM machine. And so the fact is that leaving that vacuum allowed mischief to take place and allowed ISIS as one component of that mischief to begin to grow and thrive.
I want to move to the Pope. You've no doubt been watching what he's been saying. Give me your take on the Pope and his involvement in the temporal sphere. You see what he's done in Cuba, forging this rapprochement between the United States and the Castro regime. Is that a good movement forward, or are you concerned about it?
Look, on faith and morals, he's my Pope, he's your Pope. On politics and science, he's not. And I think he ought to stay out of it. But that's my personal opinion.
Are you worried about this environmental encyclical?
I'm worried about a number of things. The environmental encyclical, in my opinion, is a huge mistake. It's based on, in my opinion, faulty science. And I think the Pope has been sold a bill of goods. But to try and somehow imply a credibility to a position that is unproven is, in my opinion, a mistake. The Church made a mistake with Galileo, and I hope he doesn't make the same kind of a mistake here.
Okay, let's get back to terra firma and more comfortable topics. Looking at this Republican field, who could you see yourself supporting? Who do you think best reflects the vision and the sensibility that George H.W. Bush brought to the office?
I have too many friends in this game to try and pick out one or the other. There's a handful and they're the top tier. Everybody knows who they are. I really do have a partiality, however, to governors and former governors. I really think the mess that the country is in right now needs someone who has managed a legislature as a chief executive and dealt with creating legislation and laws, who has been able to harness, if you will, the tendency of a bureaucracy to grow, and has been able to deal and live amongst his constituents the way a governor does. Yeah. And so I lean towards governor and former governors, and there's a handful of them running that I think any one of which would be a good president.
What are the qualities that George H.W. Bush brought to office that you think some of these, particularly the top tier, could benefit from? What are they missing?
I think the most important thing that George Bush brought to office was character, self-discipline, modesty, and a willingness to listen to people. One of the great things in the White House we had is he had good people there. We mentioned Jimmy Baker, Brent Scowcroft, Roger Porter, Dick Darman on domestic policy, Boyd and Gray. Right. He would bring us in on issues and ask us to talk to him about the issue. And you could say whatever you wanted to this president. You could argue with him as hard as you wanted on one side of a position or another. And he would then draw a decision, and the team was solid enough that you would then go out and march to the president's tune.